Good morning, Baronosphere, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the UK Chamber of Shipping's Future and Alternative Fuels event. Very warm welcome. I hope you're not too exhausted from the work you've all been doing this week. I'm sure everyone's shoes are very worn out. So Baronosphere, you're very welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all feeling chipper. I woke up this morning and thought, oh my God, I think I've run out of words. But then I realised that we're going to talk about alternative fuels, and I realised that I probably didn't. But I'm not wearing my high heels today because my feet are absolutely shot. Never mind. Right, so what are we here to talk about? Future and alternative fuels. And so, the obvious question is, well, which one's going to come out on top? Well, firstly, I don't know. And secondly, I'm pretty sure that it won't be just one, because there is no easy answer to how we're going to decarbonise maritime. Although I'm not allowed to talk about aviation, I will very briefly, because of course for aviation there is quite a good pathway to decarbonisation. You've got SAF, and then hydrogen will come in, and then you're going to have carbon capture, and then you're done. Maritime, I don't see the pathway as clearly as that, excuse me, just yet. So we really do need to think about what the needs are for alternative fuels and what the demands are going to be for the future. Because, of course, again, we know maritime is massively diverse, and what fuel is suitable for one vessel will not be suitable for another. So what can the government do about all of this? Because at the end of the day, it ain't going to be us that decides which fuels are going to be used in the future. It is going to be up to the technology and which ones come forward, and then it'll be about market demand. So from my perspective, I will try and be as technology agnostic as possible, because I think that's really, really important. But what we can do is we can create the growing conditions out of which the answer, or the answers to the question, will undoubtedly come. So let me just set you a little bit of context and talk about actually a couple of things that we have done and other things that we have announced today. And somebody, I was at the French ambassador's residence last night. I don't know if anybody else was there. It was quite nice, wasn't it? Yeah, I got I was a little jealous. But I was talking to the French minister. This is a complete by the way. I was talking to the French minister, who I know and love, Hervé, and he said, oh, this London International Shipping Week, it's really great, isn't it? He said, I think we're going to do one in France. And I looked at him and went, but no one will come. We've got one already, so just don't bother. But anyway, they were very jealous about our London International Shipping Week, and I was quite jealous of their ambassador's residence. So anyway, but why should industry really focus on this? And somebody answered that question for me yesterday at the residence, and that was, it is going to become more costly to be dirty. And at the moment, some people haven't quite figured that out, but somehow it's going to become more costly. We are going to have to incentivize industry to change. So I would encourage you to think about this in a competitive way as well, that there are going to be ways that you can gain an advantage by going greener quicker. Because I also think that your customers, whether they be people or whether they be freight, will also start making demands of you. So it really is potentially an existential crisis. So across the UK and indeed across the world, we are moving to a period of cleaner, more sustainable energy sources. There have been big commitments made, big targets, big ambition, and of course the government and industry have to work together to tackle this. I don't need to convince anybody in the room about the stark threat that climate change poses, thinking only of sea level rises and what that might do to some of our ports, and the impact on lives and livelihoods would be very, very significant. So we've got to think about reducing global emissions and raising sustainability standards. Now, for transport, I think we did quite well. I was not in post, so I'm not taking any glory for this, by coming out with the Clean Maritime Plan in 2019. But of course, that was 4 years ago. And the world of decarbonisation has moved on leaps and bounds since then. So my officials are working very hard at the moment, and they will be talking to industry as they're developing this on a new, refreshed Clean Maritime Plan, which we hope to publish by the end of the year. And of course, alternative fuels will form a key part of that. So the uptake of alternative fuels is going to be absolutely key to realising maritime decarbonisation. And the plan that we put together around getting there needs to allow for flexibility, and it has to encourage innovation. And it also, of course, has to work for business. And so put simply, that's not just about government laying down the law. It's about shaping future fuels in maritime. It's about listening, engaging, and influencing. So, for example, at the IMO, I think we actually had a very good outcome. The UK worked incredibly hard with other nation states in order to get there. I think there are two things that we need to do. We need to reassure some of the less developed countries around what the outcome means. And I also think we need to put our arms around some of those nations that came potentially a bit further than they would have liked to in order to get agreement. And that's certainly something that I will focus on when COP28 comes around. So, as a result of those ambitious outcomes, as you will all know, there is going to be a comprehensive impact assessment which will look at a range of new regulatory measures, including a GHG fuel standard, which is going to be key. And what I'm really pleased to see is we've got a timeline to adopt them by 2025, implement by 2027. That's not very far away. Many of us, maybe not me, will still be in our jobs by then. So really need to start thinking about that. So whatever we do domestically, we have to align with what is set out in the IMO, otherwise it's going to be too complicated and actually will lead to the wrong incentives. So we have, for example, the Maritime Fuels Task and Finish Group, a really important part of the Clean Maritime Council, and they're looking at maritime fuels and how we can take that forward. I've also decided that I'm going to chair the Clean Maritime Council in future because I do think it should have ministerial involvement because it is so important to all of you. So at the same time, we can't discuss decarbonisation and omit the great swathes of projects that are happening. So this is my moment when I tell you about all the good things the Department for Transport are doing for decarbonisation. So you'll all have heard of UK Shore, absolutely key. It's our shipping office for reducing emissions, and it has a total pot of £206 million. This is the largest investment in maritime that we've made in a long time. And we chose decarbonisation because it is so important. Already we've spent £175 million on 105 projects. And they cover all sorts of different things. One bunch of that was announced earlier this week, and there were 10 projects for the Zero Emission Vessels and Infrastructure Fund. Because there's no point in just doing the vessels and no point just doing the ports or the shore-based infrastructure. You have to try and do them together to get the evidence that you need. And that's what these projects are all about. Because it is absolutely key to get the data from these projects such that we can figure out which ones worked and which ones didn't. So we invested £80 million in those projects. They are all across the UK. They take in all sorts of people from industry, from academia, from the local communities, really, really important. And two of them focus on methanol and green hydrogen, respectively. But that is not the extent of our announcements. We've got one today. I don't know if any of you have seen it so far. We are funding a consortium of 13 universities led by Durham University, and they will be running the Clean Maritime Research Hub. £7.4 million worth of funding coming from UK Shore and the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council. But as importantly, it's being matched by nearly £10 million from industrial partners. So if you'd like to get involved, I would absolutely encourage you to do so, because that research hub will be bringing together all of the different strands so that we can actually start formulating more evidence to support our policy making. The second thing that we're doing is we're announcing £1.5 million of UK Shore funding towards the International Green Corridor Fund. Now, I was on a really interesting panel a couple of days ago about green corridors. I really think that they are the future. We can do the whole sector at once, but it's going to be incremental. What I'm really hoping is that green corridors will provide the trailblazers so that people can see what can be done. So this £1.5 million funding, what we're doing is using that for feasibility studies. Well, and this is for international ones, so we're working very closely with the Netherlands, Norway and Denmark, and I've had numerous discussions with the ministers there about green corridors and decarbonisation. So we're all going to try and work together and think about how we make these green routes a reality. So we haven't got all the answers here and now. I hope you can see that the Department for Transport is investing in this, and I hope that you are all investing in this too, because I think it is absolutely critical for the future of the UK shipping industry. Because the government can create the growing conditions that will help future and alternative fuels not only flourish but thrive, but I also think that I'm afraid you guys have a huge part to play in getting us there. So that is the long answer to the question that you'll all be considering today. I know that there are challenges, and trust me, it makes my brain hurt sometimes when I try and think through all of this stuff. But that's why we need to talk to you, we need to talk to the experts, we need the expertise, we need the ambition, so that we can make the right sort of policies which will create the right framework for which you can plan in. So thank you all for all that you do. Enjoy the rest of Shipping Week. I hope to see many of you at the gala dinner tonight. I am not speaking at the gala dinner, so therefore I'm going to sit there and enjoy myself, and I cannot wait. Thank you all so much.
Baroness Fear, thank you very much indeed. Would the panel like to come and take their seats? And while they're taking their seats, I'll just introduce our moderator for this session, Sarah Kenny, who's CEO of PMT, and she'll be leading this discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks again to the Chamber of Shipping and to Peter for his leadership in setting up today's session, which, if you look around the room, you will see is phenomenally well attended. So Baroness Veer has very eloquently provided a great introduction, which saves me reading through some of my notes this morning. But just to highlight some of the key points before I move on and introduce our panel of speakers this morning. She very wisely made the point that in all likelihood there won't be a single choice of fuel. She also made the point about the role of regulation and the importance of regulation. I think as we move to our panel discussion this morning, I'd encourage us all to think about, does regulation lead or does technology lead? Who leads and who follows in this environment, where certainly the compelling argument that if global shipping emissions contribute 3% to greenhouse gases, and with the progressive statement, I think, by the IMO recent MEPC session around achieving net zero by 2050, it should be a galvanising thought in everybody's minds around our footprint as a shipping and maritime sector overall, and what the key actions we need to take, not just around fuels, but around wider aspects of maritime operations, including navigation, hull form efficiency and others. But today we're talking about future fuels. And I'm delighted that we have a panel here today who are going to provide a perspective on each of a few fuels for your delectation and enjoyment this morning. Online, I'm hoping, there she is, we have Maria Stranderson, Director and Head of Future Fuels at Maersk. Thank you for joining us, Maria. We have Michael Bowe, founder and CEO of Core Power, who's going to be talking about nuclear. Mark Darley, Chief Operations Officer at Lloyd's Register, and Steve Brown, Manager of Technology at Shell. So we have a great panel who are going to present the case for a variety of different fuels this morning. I'm going to start, Michael, if I may, with you. If you think about, perhaps you could just give us, first of all, a quick introduction, who you are and your position on nuclear for the rest of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us here. It's a pleasure to see you all. We're bringing nuclear to the maritime market, but also bringing maritime to the nuclear market. I think we have two industries that desperately need a solution that we can move forward with. And just to sort of frame this a little bit, Sarah, what we've done is sort of try to see this from a fairly high level perspective. And what we've got an $8 trillion industry in our best estimate that transports close to 90% of all goods. It's the backbone of global trade, effectively. We consume 350 million odd tons of heavy fuel oil, and we generate, and I don't know if you know this, 4 billion megawatt hours of energy every year. That's 4 petawatt hours of energy, sort of electricity equivalent, emitting about 1 billion tons of CO2, about 3%, and we've been mandated to go to zero. So moving transport of global trade away from fossil fuels actually presents I would say, an almost unsurmountable challenge of scale. It's not just technologies, it's the scale of that technology. Now, the alternative fuels that are mostly discussed is ammonia, methanol, alternative fuels that would function in conventional engines. But if we produce those fuels as we do today, which is almost entirely from natural gas, we will go from 3% of global emissions up by a factor of 5 to about 15% of global emissions. And for us, I don't think that's really a solution. So we recognize that actually nuclear, love it or hate it, is the only true zero emission technology and fuel for the lifetime of a ship. And no other energy source or power system can give us really a true zero emission footprint. And that's an important thing to recognize. And we know that naval reactors, the Navy's been using nuclear power safely and securely for 69 years now, since 1954. And they've proven that reactors can be operated safely at sea, tolerating pitching, rolling, heaving of the ocean, and do millions of miles without refueling on zero emissions. But naval reactors cannot be commercially insured. And since we're the insurers hall, I think that's an important point to make. You cannot commercially insure them. So we can't bring them into ports. And if you can't bring them into ports, well, that's a bit of a showstopper, right? So we need a new nuclear solution. We need something that's different, something that is actually appropriate for our industry and something that we can work with. And that's what we're building. So a new nuclear, we can do two different things. We can provide that clean power to create those hydrogen-based fuels, so we don't go from 3% to 15%, which is incredibly important. Otherwise, we're painting ourselves into a corner. And of course, we can power large ships directly with nuclear. And that's a radical new way of doing things, which I think really would work here. So, we could with new nuclear solve the climate and pollution effects from global trade. I think that's a very significant thing. So I started the company Core Power back in 2018 to build this new technology with partners now in the United States, hopefully also across Europe. And it's based on a liquid-fueled reactor. I won't go into the technology here, but we're currently building one in the United States, and it's going to go critical. It's a small test reactor going to go critical in Idaho, of all places, in 2026. So it's happening faster than you think. We're also doing everything we can to help governments and international governmental organizations like the IMO and the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna to build frameworks for how we regulate and build a brand new market for this, so that we get technology agnosticism into the system, so we can demonstrate and we can prototype and we can show how this would work. It's a very big challenge, and we have to be brave and work hard to solve a big problem like this.
Michael, thank you very much. I think if we could test our Teams link and see if we can get Maria, could you provide us a quick introduction to yours and Maersk's position, please, on methanol?
Yes, sure. I'll start by saying that, we've come a lot further than we thought a few years ago would be possible. Back in 2018, when we set out our target of becoming carbon neutral, we also set the target of having our first green container vessel in the waters by 2030. And as you can see on the screen behind me today, as we speak actually, we are baptizing our first green methanol container vessel here in Copenhagen. So a lot has happened, and it's gone farther and faster than we thought. And here I would like to mention that has only been possible by the support from our partners and the regulatories and our customers, of course, as well. Looking back, we've spent the last 3 or 4 years diving into the different fuel options out there. And we've looked a lot. And we do see green methanol as the only scalable fuel solution for marine right now. And let me just put a few more words on that. Here I talk about big ships, large container vessels. Of course, we talk ferries or other smaller, ships. They have other options as batteries and hydrogen perhaps. But on the large container ships, we do see green methanol as one of the really good options. The reasons being that, first of all, the engine technology is quite mature. Also the reason why we have a ship in the water already now. It has low toxicity, both towards humans and the aquatic organisms. It's easy to handle. It's liquid at ambient temperature, etc. And you can produce it in a variety of ways, both the e-methanol pathway and the biomethanol pathway, where you rely on biofeedstocks. So we're quite confident with green methanol being one of our fuel options. But of course, we are still looking at other options as well, including ammonia, which we are still evaluating and which might enter our fuel mix in the future. Talking about scalability, I mean, besides the vessel that we have in the water now, we have additional 24 large container vessels on order, all to run on green methanol. They will be deployed in the coming years, and around 2026-ish, when most of them are in the water, we will need to burn about 750,000 tons of green methanol per year, which is a significant amount. And we do also see a growing number of orders of methanol container ships worldwide. I believe the number is now above 25, just on container ships alone. I believe if you take other ships in as well, it's more than 200 that's on order, which is really great because that creates a really significant demand signal that will really, help unlock this hen and egg dilemma that we faced a few years back. So finishing off with a few words on the challenges that we see ahead. Of course, the main challenge we see right now is scaling green methanol fast enough. But we knew as first movers that this would be a challenge. And this is also the reason why we have built our vessels as dual fuel vessels, so they can also run on a traditional fuel. But we're proud to say that for the feeder vessel that has come out now, we did actually manage to secure green methanol for its maiden voyage, and also the fuel it will run on starting next year. It will be e-methanol supplied by European Energy. So we are confident, and we do see a growing number of green methanol suppliers in our pipeline. So we are confident that the scaling will happen. But of course, we also would like to see a really strong regulatory framework coming up from IMO. We really need a strong greenhouse gas pricing mechanism to help close the price gap on the fuels. And we also find it really important that these new regulations take into account not only CO2, but all greenhouse gases, and also take into consideration the life cycle phase of the fuels. So I would say that is my 5 minutes, yes.
Maria, thank you so much. Really helpful, thank you. Mark, I know Lloyd's rightly adopt a technology agnostic position in this, but you're here today to talk about ammonia. So over to you.
Well, morning everybody, and thanks Sarah for getting the disclaimer in. Clearly as Lloyd's Register, we are agnostic of fuels. Ours is to support the industry in getting the fuels into the industry, using them at scale safely. But yeah, thanks for getting that in. And at the risk of this sounding a bit like a sort of top trump of future fuels, but I'll start by referencing a report that through our Decarbonisation Hub was released last week, and that's looked at the future fuels and the trends for future fuels, and it really looked across 25 reports that are out in the industry to try and make sense of, okay, well, what are some of the pathways that could exist across different scenarios, and really two main pathways and trends came out of that. One of them was actually biofuels, and understand there's nobody on the panel today to talk about biofuels, so that's biodiesel or biomethane. But the second one really is the hydrogen-based economy and hydrogen-based fuels, with obviously e-ammonia seen as taking a greater share when we look forward. In fact, when we look forward, you take within those reports, ammonia, whether that's e-ammonia or whether that's blue ammonia, taking about 47% share, with e-ammonia taking about 35% of that share. So it's clear that it has a part to play in that energy transition. So what do we know about ammonia? What advantages does it have? Well, clearly, if you're generating it from a renewable source, it's near zero fuel. It has a high energy density compared to hydrogen, less so compared to methanol. It's relatively easy to transport, minus 33 versus minus 250 or 163 with LNG. And whilst limited, there isn't existing infrastructure around the world. But clearly there are some disadvantages and challenges as well with ammonia. The first one being its toxicity. Just to put that in perspective, ammonia is lethal at about 1,500 parts per million. If you take methanol, it's about 10 times, so it's about 14,000 parts per million. But I think that the other disadvantages are there's still a lot of work, and we're actively involved with a number of our partners in really understanding what happens when you burn ammonia in engines, the production of NOx, the production of nitrous oxide. These are data points and things that we are understanding more about. But the main sort of significant disadvantage really is around the people and the human implications, and that plays itself out in a number of different forms. Of course, it plays itself out in terms of the regulations and then in terms of the ship design. It plays itself out in terms of societal acceptance. Mikhail spoke about the societal acceptance of nuclear around the world. But we haven't really had at scale a toxic substance being bunkered within the shipping industry. There's a competency element, there's a societal acceptance element. Our report this week looking at decarbonisation trends estimates that about 1 million seafarers will have to be upskilled to support the use and transportation of ammonia alone. And I think, as you know, there is a challenge with current policy. The IGC code doesn't permit the burning of toxic cargoes. There's a paper going in actually in a few weeks to the IMO to address that. And whilst the IGF code does permit the use of ammonia, clearly in an industry that likes, I would say, being told what to do when it comes to regulation, we're a very sort of reactive, prescriptive industry. The regulation that we have today it isn't adequate. It's very goal-based, and it's quite difficult for people to understand, particularly when we're trying to understand it at the scale that we need to understand it to achieve the targets. So just in terms of some of the other challenges of ammonia, there's a big challenge when it comes to production. Today we do produce ammonia as an industry. Somewhere between 185 to 200 million tons of ammonia are produced worldwide every year, but most of that is used, as we all know, for the fertilizer industries. Now that 200 million tons equates, when you look at it on an energy basis, equates to about a 3.4 energy basis joules. Just remember that number. Now, if we're going to meet the shipping demand in terms of how much do we need 4.7 energy basis joules of energy. That's more than that 200 million tons that's been generated today. And 2.7 of that to generate e-ammonia. Now, hydrogen being the main feedstock of e-ammonia clearly is also a cost driver, along with how expensive is the generation of renewable fuels. So in the world of top trumps, Mikhail, I take your renewable energy, and Steve, I take your hydrogen.
Mark, thank you very much. So Steve, Mark's going to take your hydrogen, and someone's going to see you something else. I haven't worked the top trumps analogy quite through properly yet, but would you like to make the case for hydrogen, please?
I will, thank you. Morning, everyone. So my name is Steve Brown, as introduced by Sarah. I look after an R&D team within Shell Shipping and Maritime, and our major focus these last, I think it's about 7 years we've been going, has been on decarbonisation and decarbonising safely. Today, talking about hydrogen, and that's not to say we haven't looked at the other options being discussed today. We continue to, but hydrogen is very definitely our major area of focus. And why is that? After 7 years of work, why are we still putting an awful lot of effort into hydrogen to make it a reality in the future? So, firstly, the molecule. It's the most abundant molecule element in the universe, 75% of all matter. In terms of its energy per weight unit, it's the highest. It's very, very light. It can be produced from green sources. I don't entirely agree with Mikhail's statement earlier that nuclear is the only zero greenhouse gas solution. I think hydrogen can be too, as well as nuclear indeed. And when it is burned, consumed, converted, there is zero emissions other than water, potentially. Next, what am I going to say next? For shipping, hazards, hydrogen, it has challenges. It's a handful, widest flammable range of any element. The ignition energy is very, very, very low. That makes for a challenging product, a challenging element for us to manage on the ships. And so the work we've been doing these last few years has been to understand hydrogen, and we're doing lots and lots of testing at the facility in Spade Adam in Cumbria, where we're doing everything you can think of, setting it on fire, spilling it as liquid form, enclosing it, then setting it on fire to really understand the animal. And with that understanding, we can design for it. And the designs will be radically different, that's for sure. And I think they will need to be radically different for the other options also. I think there is an assumption in the industry that we can plug in new fuels to the old systems, and we don't agree with that. The hazards presented by these new fuels are considerably more challenging, and we also would suggest that you can't just train that out. You can't just give people more training, but then give them these new challenges. We need to manage this through design. So we need to design out the risk and remove our human colleagues, our seafaring colleagues, people living in the ports close to these operations from harm. What are we doing in Shell to enable hydrogen? Lots and lots of demonstration projects already ongoing. We have our Suiso Frontier, that's an LH2 carrier, purely experimental. She's now carried 2 cargoes from from Australia to Japan. We're commissioning new technologies to enable that supply chain in the future. And I was lucky enough to be on board the ship last week, and it was very, very impressive. I think the other thing that really stood out was how much LH2, liquefied hydrogen carried shipping, benefits from LNG. Much of the materials science, technologies, and then the know-how to make that happen. We're looking at fuel cell technologies as alternative energy converters, higher efficiency. So that starts to address Mark's point around the energy density. So if we have much, much more efficient energy converters, then we need less fuel. But also benefiting from that weight point I made up earlier. With such a light product, we can actually put it in parts of the hull we're not really using today. They're full of fresh air. So we can start to think a little bit about design and actually ending up in a situation, we believe, where you'll be able to carry more cargo on a hydrogen-fueled vessel than you can a conventional ship today. So lots and lots going on, a long runway ahead of us. We're waiting for the green supply, of course, coming from electrolyzers. What comes out of an electrolyzer is hydrogen. It isn't ammonia, it isn't methanol. And why we like hydrogen is because if it is to work, it will be because it goes through a fewer number of conversions than its competitors, but it also because it will be a multi-sector solution. Shipping won't choose the fuel alone. We will probably piggyback the efforts of other sectors and the investment of other sectors. And I'll close there. Thank you, Sarah.
Steve, thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. Some really important themes actually have emerged from each of your overviews of your particular fuel type. I'd like to just pick up, each of you mentioned safety, regulation, the implication for seafarers in some way, shape or form, whether it be skills or frankly living and working on board with these fuels. If we step back and think about ship owners and operators, many of whom are represented in this room today, I think Baroness Veer made a comment around risk aversion, and actually, ultimately the cost benefit will drive the decision to move. But of course, you've mentioned lots of other drivers that will create the impetus to move. If you are a ship owner and operator, if you put yourself in their shoes, or indeed the shoes of their customers, what do you think that the key arguments or barriers to change are? How do you convince this community to move with your
your alternative fuel and to move with it at pace. Michael, can I come to you first, please?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sarah. I've spent many years working for ship owners and doing all sorts of work in actual shipping companies, running, building, operating, decommissioning, selling ships. It's not a team sport. It's economics at the end of the day. If you can go faster for less money, and you can deliver on time, and you can do it without stopping for refueling, you can provide benefits in the ports that you call in. Like, for example, if you had a nuclear electric ship calling into a port where you can plug that electricity into the port and provide enough power to run your loaders, dischargers, pumps, gantry cranes, whatever it might be, you're changing the contract with the public. It comes down to that. It doesn't, we've seen throughout last winter, all over Europe, we've seen, communities screaming with pain from higher energy bills. Our industry cannot afford to go down the route of $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a ton fuels that we hope are going to get cheaper, or we can close the gap with taxes. Because we're just passing the buck at the end of the day. If we've got to decarbonize, we've got to be real about it. And when it comes to regulators and governments, it's all very well to say, we need to do this. We have no idea how. It's up to you lot to sort it out. And we've got to go back to some very basic first principles. We've got to go back to things we learned at school. I hear what you say, Stephen, about hydrogen, and it's a fantastic, wonderful sort of discussion that's going on around this. But we have to remember a couple of things about hydrogen. It's sort of third, fourth grade, chemistry that we learn about this. A liquid hydrogen, a cubic meter of liquid hydrogen, just to remind everyone, a cubic meter of liquid hydrogen is 71 kilos. A cubic meter of bunker fuel is 991 kilos. The largest VLCC that we have on the water today will carry, if it could, theoretically 17,000 tons of hydrogen. If we're going to produce millions and millions and millions of tons of this stuff, we actually have to do it where we need it, because the transportability, I know that it's been tried and its safety record is good, etc. But practically speaking, that scale isn't there because you can't make it more compact. It is the lightest thing we have, and you can't move it reliably from one place to the other. So if we're going to use hydrogen as the base feedstock for ammonia, for methanol, for sustainable aviation fuel, etc., we're going to have to make it where we need it. And green corridors fit into that, because at the either end of a green corridor, we could effectively have production plants, but they need to be powered by something that doesn't increase the emissions on the back end, but in fact brings the back end emissions down to zero as well. So there has to be some sort of coming together of government, regulators, industry, all those that stand behind this and say, look, what's this really all about? And how are we actually going to do this? And can we take, our perceived ideas versus reality and try to figure out what it is that's actually going to happen? What we don't want to create is an industry that is there to make money out of a transition and then run away with the money when the transition hasn't happened because it was built on false premises. So, I agree with everything that's been said here. I agree with what the Baroness said. I agree with everyone. But we've got to kind of get real.
Michael, thank you.
Steve, would you like to respond at all to that?
I can. Yeah. I guess in response to the point around energy density, so Mikael is talking in terms of tons. We should probably talk in terms of energy. So we should talk from a shipping point of view, and aviation also suffers the same challenge as our shipping folks, that the amount of volume we use is important. So if we use more of the hull for fuel, we're using it less for cargo. And that Mikael's correct. We need, compared to heavy fuel oil, we're going to need 5.2 times as much volume as we do as heavy fuel oil today. But if we use much, much higher efficiency ship designs and energy converters, we can maybe half that. Then if we start to use parts of the hull which we didn't use before, we benefit also from a very, very low density. We can actually increase the freeboard of the vessels. So ultimately, from the same kind of molded dimensions, we can actually get a lot more energy on an LH2 carrier. And those principles also apply to, say, container shipping as well. And our work is already suggesting that we'll be able to carry more cargo from the same hull dimensions with more of that volume on board. And it's preying on the properties of the product and actually using the hull more effectively for those future fuels. So that would be my response to that. Mikhail's point is correct. But then energy density is a challenge for all of the future fuels that we look forward to in the future. They're not as good as hydrocarbons from that point of view.
Thank you. Really good points. I'm going to bring it back to the point about ship owners and operators. So if, what's the compelling argument for any one type of fuel if you're a ship owner and operator sitting in the audience today? And actually, Maria, I'd like to come to you, if I may, just to give your thoughts, your perspectives from Maersk on what you see as the reality and the message that you'd like to give to ship owners and operators in the room today.
Well, I think I will repeat a bit what I said earlier, that our studies have shown that green methanol is the only scalable green fuel option available today. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there might not be other fuels entering the fuel mix going forward. I might maybe add a few words on the hydrogen also as well, because we have looked a bit into hydrogen in a fuel cell scenario on one of the smallest feeder vessels to see if that could sort of make sense. And it still turns out to be too expensive TCO-wise compared to running the same vessel on methanol in a combustion engine. But that was due to the higher capex of the fuel cell systems. And of course also the energy used for liquefying the hydrogen. So, and especially the capex on the fuel cells, I mean, they might drop in the future as technology develops. So things might change in the future. But I mean, if you want to get started now, I would say that green methanol is a good option. And then of course keep an eye open for other fuels. And maybe to add also a bit more on the when I say green methanol, I mean of course both biomethanol and e-methanol. And we know and recognize that there's a challenge in scaling renewable electricity and thereby green hydrogen production fast enough to bring down the price of the e-methanol. So we do expect to rely for quite some years on biomethanol, which consumes considerably less renewable electricity in the production. So that is also a sort of a pathway to follow.
I'm going to come to Mark to talk about infrastructure. So we had a few references to shore-based infrastructure, the need to be able to produce, store locally. Clearly, the infrastructure argument, this industry is international by design. So first mover advantage is going to seem like a peculiar thing when you're not quite sure who's going to go first, who's going to pick which fuels in which ports, what operational impact is that going to have? Is it going to be a barrier to operations, or actually get it right, it's an enabler to operations? It might be a source of competitive advantage. What are your thoughts about the connection between the shipping industry and the infrastructure side of the industry, and what needs to happen to catalyse and move this forwards?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is, if I took a poll of people in this room, I'd say 90% of the people in this room are from the shipping industry. And when you talk about infrastructure and you talk about addressing the infrastructure challenge, clearly we've got to get better at talking to other industries. Because it's not just us that are having this conversation about energy transitions and decarbonisations and how much fuel we need where around the world. And it's a conversation I don't think, we're having often enough, and clearly in that conversation, we're probably not going to be at the top of the list for some of the fuels that we're talking about today. But I think, Mikko can maybe talk about in terms of not necessarily bunkering, but using nuclear and how that might change, how ships get their fuel, where ships go. But it's equally prevalent within ammonia supply chains as well. And I think from a supply chain perspective, whether it's ammonia, whether it's hydrogen, or whether it's nuclear, I think we have to recognise, I'll go back to the impact on humans and training. We have to recognise that it's not just 750,000 crew that we need to train on board in terms of the handling of ammonia. In my case, it is the port infrastructure, it's the bunkering, it's the local communities. Look at how bunkering is done in Singapore today. It's a much broader ecosystem that then has an influence in terms of where we can put that infrastructure and how that infrastructure is going to be used, I think.
Very similar to Mark, to be honest. I would only repeat his comments. I think what we need to do is get the whole supply chain talking. We need to standardise, we need consistency in how we approach the safety standards, not only the practices, but the design side as well. So hugely important on that side. I guess from our side, representing hydrogen today, if you think of, say, a Chile or a Morocco where we have this abundance of renewable power, we would then seek to convert some of that renewable power into hydrogen for export. Or we wouldn't, Chile and Morocco would. And the demand centres like Europe, Asia, America would want to buy that clean energy. And that will likely be cheaper than making it yourself in the North Sea, for instance. We will need to get the liquefaction technology to work. I mean, it does work. The laws of thermodynamics don't change because it's hydrogen. We just need to get it colder and manage the other risks with hydrogen. But I think once we do get there, and we're quite confident we will, and we deliver that clean energy to the customer, that energy will then be available, be distributed as gas is today. It won't need to be converted as some of the energy carriers might be. And so you're not then asking your buyer to then invest in an enormous amount of infrastructure and find a footprint to install that equipment. So that might still end up being the right way to go if ammonia proves to be a better energy carrier and the decomposition and purification parts can be overcome and made more efficient. But as it stands today, if you look at gas, we will deliver to the customer, they'll have storage, but thereafter it's gasified and sent to the grid. And so all of these things will have to be considered and looked at from an end-to-end point of view, economically, TCO, life cycle cost, before we can make the right decisions.
Steve, thank you. Michael, I'm going to come to you because everyone's mentioned the various sort of safety, environmental concerns around different fuels. Nuclear carries a perception issue, fairly or otherwise. And clearly from a land-based infrastructure point of view, that's going to have an influence on stakeholder perception, whether it's public or consumers. What's your view on how you overcome that from an infrastructure point of view?
So unpacking two big issues right there. Let me do the infrastructure bit first, and we can talk about this perception of safety afterwards. I mean, back in the 1960s, a decision was made in this country to build an orbital motorway around London, and it was a grand project of the future. When it opened in 1984, it was woefully inadequate for the amount of capacity that it needed. We took one step forward into the future. We tried to transition into the future by taking one careful step forward. What we've actually got to do, and civil infrastructure is a critical component of this. We're entering a third or a second, or whatever we want to call it, industrial revolution. This is going to be a big change, and we've got to try and visualize and envision an end game, not just to try to take one step into the jungle and hope we get to the other end of it and see what's there. We've got to imagine and visualize what's at the other end of this. And then we've got to think about infrastructure and learn from the past and say, it's not about building something that's going to be woefully inadequate in 2050 or 2060 or 2070. We've got to think about how we do this. Modularity. Shipyard manufacturing is one of those key things that this industry can bring to civil infrastructure. If we can do fuels at sea, if we can do energy at sea, if we can do production at sea, if we can use the offshore environment, we can create scale and flexibility and scale through the capacity that this industry has. It's reinvention. It's taking things we've got and using them for other things and scaling them up to create that flexibility in civil infrastructure. When it comes to safety, I think, and I'll reference what I said before, we've all got to get together and get real, right? Look at the facts. facts. Don't look at our beliefs and dogmas and superstitions that we have from the past. I mean, I have friends and colleagues who've spent years working on nuclear submarines. They sleep next to weapons-grade reactor cores, and they do it for years. They don't know radiological damage in any of those environments. The actual effects of the three sort of scare scenarios of nuclear accidents happening around the world have actually been rather minor. You know, Fukushima, 1 death. 3 Mile Island, 0 deaths. Direct effect of the worst of them all, the sort of rusting Soviet sarcophagus of Chernobyl, 39. Really? You know, there is a perception here which is, it's important that we get away from talking about safety as a perception and talk about safety as a real thing, right? It's a long time since we had a problem with this, and we've got to kind of move forward with it. We talk about safety, we should talk about the types of safety, not safety itself.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, Mark, I'm going to come to you because I think ammonia probably cops it next in the league table of public perception.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
To be honest, I agree with what Michael said. So, yeah, it cops it in the league table. I think, what are some of my thoughts? It was really interesting. Earlier this week, there was an editorial from Richard Mead where he spoke about the culture that we have in this industry. It plays a bit to your point. You know, we're coming to the party, so to speak, or coming to the jungle in your case, with a legacy culture and legacy beliefs of what we should be doing, but equally at what pace we should be doing things. You know, I've got relatively young children, and clearly, you know, by the time that they grow up, it's going to be a much more pressing position that they find themselves in, and that will influence the structure and beliefs in terms of then, you know, how quickly we can do things. I think in terms of ammonia, again, just to be sort of semi-controversial, if I went out this door and asked anybody how are ships fueled today, I think I'd struggle to find somebody that actually knew the answer to that. So we've got to raise the understanding of maritime, of course, and clearly this is going to be more expensive. Some of that cost, a lot of that cost will ultimately be passed on to the consumers, to us in some degree. So if we can turn that round into a positive and raise the understanding of what's happening in shipping, what's happening in terms of the fuel choice, whether it is ammonia that cops it next, and then put that drive in the consumers to actually support us making some of these decisions.
Thank you, Mark. We're running short of time, sadly. I think this could go on for quite some time. So I'm going to very unfairly ask each of the panel, and I'm going to give them literally 30 seconds to think about this, to think of the top 3 things, so we're back on top trumps, the top 3 things that you think can accelerate our collective progress in this field, either in the fuel that you've chosen or more generally in terms of alternative fuels to help us on the path to net zero by 2050 or sooner. Whilst you're thinking on that, we've had a really good discussion today. Thank you so much for everyone's contribution and the questions that came in from the Chamber of Shipping members. Thank you. I think this has been a really thoughtful discussion. It's highlighted the fact that, frankly, there is we know there's a role for policy and regulation. We know that there's a need to make the investment case. We also know that this is a sector I wouldn't necessarily describe as risk averse. I think there's just a commercial reality that this is a very long life cycle industry where investment doesn't pay back for a very long time. So making investments is a very strategic decision and it needs to be made wisely. And right now with a lack of clarity around which fuels should be adopted and when and the relative merits, I can understand fully the difficulty in making the investment case as leaders of organisations that have to report to boards and deliver returns for investment. There's clearly a need for greater coordination and collaboration. All of the panel members have mentioned learning lessons from other sectors. We haven't had time to cover that today, but I think that's a rich vein if we can accelerate progress by talking to other sectors who are dealing with the same issue. But nevertheless, whatever we decide to do, the contribution of global shipping to greenhouse gas emissions is compelling, and as Michael says, it's due to increase rather significantly over the next 5 to 10 years. So doing nothing is not an option, and I'm absolutely sure that all of us are committed to playing our part as marine and maritime operators to achieving our net zero goals, because we all recognise that ultimately it's good for our business and will enable us to grow faster and do more globally. So that's my summary. Now, top trumps moment. Maria, would you like to go first? Your top 3.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I'll have to mention the strong regulatory framework as the first one, and worldwide. And maybe I could add just a few words on the complexity that we experience currently that I think could be part of sort of making it more difficult to reach the target sort of in time, is then the different regulatory schemes that develop around the world, EU ETS, EU Fuel Maritime, US, etc. They sort of have a little, they're not aligned in their approach on adopting, all greenhouse gases at a certain time. I mean, so if they could sort of be aligned a bit more, that I think would be helpful. But otherwise, I would emphasize the strong regulatory framework from IMO. That would help speed things up. Secondly, the green corridors, joining up and making the green corridors happen. That would be the second. And thirdly, I mean, there's private partnerships to help accelerate the building of fuel producing facilities. Whatever fuel they might focus at, that would definitely also be a possible pathway to accelerate. Yeah.
I think it's more fundamental than that, and
I'd say to everyone that I think we've come to a point where we've sort of realized how difficult this is going to be, and we're still asking the question, how are we going to do it? Because we've been told there's a timeline, and we have to do it by a certain time, so we have to hurry up and get something done no matter what it is. We'll end up compromising. We should change the question from how to why. And if we start asking why on everything, I mean, question everything. Don't believe what you're being told. Don't believe I'm saying that it's wrong, but don't believe everything that you're being told. Ask why. Some things are right, some things are not right. Just because somebody says it is so, it isn't necessarily so. Ask why. Then we can start to see what it is that we've actually got to do to get a solution here that we can live with. That's good for the next generation, the generation after that, etc. We build something fundamental. If we just focus on the how, building out one little bit after the other to see if we can somehow comply with what we've been told to do, I think we're going nowhere. So we've got to change the question.
Well, that told me. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, I think, very briefly, I think all three of us would benefit from being able to scale up renewable production. So getting the greenest, cheapest electron that we can supports quite a lot of our journeys. I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk within that, and that's the second one, which is collaboration. And again, not just collaboration within the industry, but you think in terms of the production of renewable electricity, just the amount of precious metals that we need. Europe needs about 26 times the amount of precious metals that we use today. And then you think about where are those precious metals mined from around the world. So again, collaboration, not just, I was on a similar panel 2 years ago, actually, at International Shipping Week, and C-word was the buzzword, but I think we realize it's collaboration not just within our own ecosystem. We've got to look a lot broader than that. And a bit to Michael's point as well, culture. Culture, not just the tactical culture in terms of how are the seafarers going to use these new fuels, how do we support them with training, development, but the broader eco society, and then really, as I said before, the culture of the industry to really sort of go into the forest and make a difference.
Thank you, Mark. And last but not least, Steve.
Thanks very much. I've got to think of some new ones to keep it interesting now. I mean, Mark's point around collaboration is probably the number one. We keep seeing, we must collaborate, and there are lots of people talking, maybe not enough doing as I would like to see. And I think even from Shell's point of view, we have to sort of break down some of the barriers with our competitors that have stood in the way for many, many years. We're going to have to work with the BPs, the Chevrons, the Exxons to make this happen, because we certainly can't do it all by ourselves. And I think with that, then we'll get the partnerships to drive forward with the technology, both on the ships, but in the production side as well, so that the molecules do become available sooner. So that will then unlock technology. And I think once we've got technology, IMO and other regulators for other sectors will then be able to say, right, it's technologically possible now, there's a regulation, as opposed to ambition, which is all we've got to go on today. So thank you.
Steve, thank you. That concludes our session today. I'd like to thank our panel, Maria, Michael, Mark, and Steve, for your contributions, and for everyone for attending today. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you.